The taste of incense still burns my throat when I remember the moment I realized what Leandros had truly become beneath that skull-faced helm. I am Brother Sergeant Castor of the Ultramarines 4th Company, and I've served alongside that walking nightmare for over 3 decades since his ascension to Chaplain rank. You think his promotion was simple justice, a loyal battle brother rewarded for his devotion to the Codex Astartes and unwavering faith in Imperial doctrine. But you don't understand what I've witnessed in the confession chambers, the tactical briefings where his voice carries weight that silences captains, or the recruitment ceremonies where his presence transforms promising neophytes into hollow-eyed zealots who quote scripture while their humanity slowly dies. The man who condemned Captain Titus for using suspicious abilities didn't become a spiritual guide. He became something far worse than any chaos corruption could produce. He became the perfect Imperial weapon, a soul so thoroughly broken by dogma that he destroys everything human he touches while believing he serves righteousness itself. Chapter 1: The Making of a Monster. The transformation of Leandros from a troubled tactical marine into one of the most dangerous individuals in the Ultramarines. Chapter began not with his elevation to Chaplain rank, but decades earlier during the events on Graia, when he made the decision that would define the remainder of his existence. Standing in the ruins of a forge world overrun by Orc forces, watching Captain Titus display abilities that exceeded normal Space Marine capabilities, Leandros faced a choice between loyalty to a brother who had saved his life repeatedly and adherence to doctrinal purity that demanded reporting suspicious behavior regardless of personal cost. The choice he made revealed psychological characteristics that the chapter's psychological screening procedures had failed to detect during his recruitment and training phases. Instead of the flexible thinking and adaptive leadership that the Ultramarines prized in their warriors, Leandros possessed a rigid mindset that prioritized abstract principles over human relationships, combined with deep-seated insecurity that manifested as need for external validation through absolute conformity to established authority. But the most dangerous aspect of his psychological profile was the complete lack of empathy that allowed him to betray a superior officer without experiencing the emotional conflict that such action should have generated in someone who possessed normal human emotional responses. The ease with which he rationalized condemning Captain Titus suggested personality disorders that approached sociopathic characteristics, masked by religious fervor that provided justification for behavior that would otherwise be recognized as psychologically aberrant. The investigation that followed his report to the Inquisition provided him with his first taste of the power that came from wielding institutional authority against individuals who lacked adequate protection from bureaucratic persecution. Watching Captain Titus disappear into inquisitorial custody while remaining officially beyond reproach for his role in that disappearance taught Leandros that the Imperial system could be manipulated to eliminate anyone whose presence created discomfort or whose achievements made others appear inadequate by comparison. The psychological satisfaction that he derived from seeing Titus removed from command revealed the underlying motivation that had driven his decision to report suspicious behavior. It had nothing to do with concern for chapter security or religious devotion to Imperial doctrine, and everything to do with personal resentment towards someone whose natural leadership abilities and tactical genius made Leandros' own limitations painfully obvious. The vindication that he received when chapter command praised his loyalty and doctrinal adherence provided reinforcement that shaped his subsequent behavior patterns. Instead of learning humility from his experience with betraying a battle brother, Leandros developed increased confidence that his interpretation of proper conduct was superior to the judgment of more experienced warriors, including officers whose service records far exceeded his own achievements. But the most significant development was his growing understanding that the Imperial system rewarded individuals who demonstrated absolute adherence to established doctrine, while punishing those who showed initiative or independent thinking that deviated from approved patterns. The lesson he absorbed was that advancement came through identifying and eliminating others who failed to meet rigid standards rather than through personal excellence or innovative achievement. The years that followed the Graia incident saw Leandros gradually transforming from someone who might have been a marginally effective tactical marine into something far more dangerous, a true believer whose faith had become weaponized against anyone who failed to demonstrate equivalent zealotry. His interpretation of the Codex Astartes evolved from tactical manual into religious text, whose every provision demanded absolute compliance regardless of situational factors that might suggest alternative approaches. The psychological mechanism that allowed this transformation involved systematically eliminating every aspect of independent judgment that might conflict with external authority, while replacing personal moral reasoning with rigid adherence to institutional policy. The process created an individual who could commit any atrocity while maintaining absolute conviction that his actions served righteous purposes. The Battle of Damnos provided early indication of how Leandros' psychological development was affecting his combat effectiveness and relationships with fellow battle brothers. His inflexibility in tactical situations created problems for squad coordination when battlefield conditions required adaptation beyond what standard doctrine addressed, while his tendency to question the loyalty of anyone who suggested modifications to established procedures created discord that undermined unit cohesion. But Damnos also revealed that his rigid adherence to doctrine could be extremely effective in specific situations where standard Imperial tactics were optimal for achieving mission objectives. His predictable behavior made him valuable for operations that required absolute reliability rather than tactical innovation, while his unwavering faith provided psychological stability that could be crucial during extended campaigns where doubt and fatigue might affect other warriors. The recognition that he received for his performance during the Damnos campaign led to his selection for advanced training programs that were designed to develop spiritual leadership capabilities among Marines who showed potential for chaplain duties. The irony was perfect. His psychological defects made him an ideal candidate for positions that required inspiring faith and maintaining morale among warriors who faced supernatural threats that could challenge even Space Marine mental conditioning. The theological education that prepared him for chaplain duties provided frameworks for understanding Imperial doctrine that reinforced every psychological tendency that made him dangerous while providing religious justification for behavior patterns that normal moral reasoning would condemn. The concept of righteous hatred for enemies of the Emperor gave legitimacy to the sadistic tendencies that he had previously been forced to suppress, while the authority to judge spiritual purity provided outlets for the control issues that drove his need to dominate others. But the most significant aspect of his chaplain training involved learning techniques for psychological manipulation that were presented as methods for inspiring faith and maintaining loyalty. The instruction he received in interrogation procedures, confession management, and morale conditioning provided him with sophisticated tools for breaking down individual psychological resistance while rebuilding personalities according to patterns that served institutional requirements. The transformation was completed through graduation ceremonies that formally invested him with authority to serve as judge of spiritual purity and guardian of doctrinal orthodoxy throughout the chapter. The skull-faced helmet that marked his new rank wasn't simply ceremonial equipment, it was symbolic representation of what he had become beneath the surface of Space Marine Brotherhood and Ultramarines tradition. Standing before the altar in the Fortress of Hera's Chapel of Devotion, newly invested with the authority to guide the spiritual development of his battle brothers, Chaplain Leandros represented the culmination of a process that had transformed personal inadequacy into institutional weapon. The Imperial system had taken someone whose psychological defects should have disqualified him from positions of responsibility, and had instead elevated him to roles where those same defects would be directed against anyone who failed to meet his standards of absolute conformity. The horror wasn't that Leandros had been corrupted by chaos or turned into some obvious monster that could be recognized and eliminated. The horror was that he had become the perfect Imperial citizen, someone so thoroughly indoctrinated that he would destroy everything human and noble in service of abstract principles, while believing absolutely in the righteousness of his actions. The transformation of Brother Leandros into Chaplain Leandros represented the Imperial system working exactly as designed, creating enforcers whose loyalty transcended human empathy, while providing them with institutional authority to reshape others according to the same dehumanizing patterns. He hadn't become a monster despite his Imperial training. He had become a monster because of it. The man who had condemned Captain Titus for displaying suspicious abilities had been transformed into something far more dangerous than any psycho or chaos cultist. He had become a weapon designed to eliminate the very human characteristics that made Space Marines capable of heroism, replacing courage and brotherhood with paranoia and compliance that would serve the Imperial machine, regardless of what it did to the souls of those who fed it. Chapter 2. The Inquisition's Perfect Asset. The relationship that developed between Chaplain Leandros and various inquisitorial factions represented one of the most disturbing examples of institutional cooperation between organizations whose missions were supposed to serve humanity's protection, but had instead evolved into mechanisms for systematic oppression of the very populations they claimed to defend. His value to the Inquisition lay not in conventional intelligence gathering or military support, but in his unique psychological profile that made him an ideal instrument for internal surveillance and elimination of potential threats within Space Marine chapters. Inquisitor Thrax of the Ordo Hereticus had been monitoring Leandros' development since the initial report regarding Captain Titus, recognizing immediately that someone capable of betraying a superior officer without emotional conflict possessed characteristics that could be extremely valuable for inquisitorial operations. The recruitment approach was subtle, informal consultations that gradually evolved into regular communication, with each interaction providing Leandros additional validation for his rigid interpretation of proper conduct while creating psychological dependency on external approval. The genius of this recruitment lay in never requiring Leandros to acknowledge that he was serving inquisitorial interests rather than chapter welfare. Every assignment that Thrax provided was presented as opportunity to ensure Ultramarines' compliance with Imperial doctrine, while the intelligence that Leandros provided was framed as necessary security assessments rather than espionage against his own battle brothers. But the most insidious aspect of this relationship involved the gradual expansion of Leandros' definition of suspicious behavior to include characteristics that had nothing to do with actual security threats. Independent thinking, exceptional tactical creativity, and personal charisma that inspired unusual loyalty among subordinates were reframed as potential indicators of corruption that required investigation regardless of the individual's service record or demonstrated commitment to Imperial values. The psychological manipulation techniques that Thrax employed to shape Leandros' development represented sophisticated understanding of how personality disorders could be weaponized through careful reinforcement of existing pathological tendencies. The validation that he received for identifying potential threats created positive feedback loops that encouraged increasingly paranoid assessment of his fellow Marines, while the authority that came with chaplain rank provided mechanisms for acting on those suspicions. The first major operation that demonstrated Leandros' value to inquisitorial interests involved the investigation of Captain Ventress of the 4th Company, whose innovative tactical approaches had achieved remarkable success against Tyranid forces, but deviated from standard Codex procedures in ways that created opportunities for questioning his loyalty. Leandros' access to confession protocols allowed him to probe Ventress' psychological state while gathering intelligence about his decision-making processes and ideological commitments. The interrogation techniques that Leandros employed during these sessions combined religious authority with psychological pressure, designed to break down mental defenses while extracting information that could be used to justify further investigation. The sacred context of confession provided cover for questioning that would have been recognized as hostile interrogation if conducted by external authorities, while Ventress' respect for chaplain authority made resistance psychologically difficult. But the most disturbing aspect of these sessions involved Leandros' systematic distortion of information that he gathered, interpreting normal human emotions and reactions as evidence of potential corruption. while ignoring obvious indicators of genuine loyalty and devotion to Imperial service. The reports that he provided to Thrax painted a picture of internal threats that existed primarily in his own paranoid imagination, rather than reflecting actual security concerns. The elimination of Captain Ventress through carefully orchestrated accusations of tactical heresy demonstrated the effectiveness of using internal chapter authority to remove individuals who posed no actual threat to Imperial security, but whose presence conflicted with rigid interpretation of proper conduct. Ventress's death during a boarding action against Chaos forces was officially classified as combat casualty, but the timing and circumstances suggested that his position had been compromised through intelligence provided by sources within his own chapter. The psychological satisfaction that Leandros derived from Ventress's removal reinforced his conviction that his methods served righteous purposes while providing motivation for expanding surveillance operations to include other potential threats within the chapter hierarchy. Each successful elimination strengthened his partnership with inquisitorial authorities while increasing his influence over chapter personnel decisions and tactical doctrine. The recruitment networks that he established among younger Marines represented perhaps his most dangerous contribution to inquisitorial operations within Space Marine organizations. Working through spiritual guidance and doctrinal instruction, he identified individuals whose psychological profiles suggested potential for development along similar lines, while gradually indoctrinating them with worldviews that prioritized abstract purity over human relationships. These recruitment efforts targeted Marines who showed signs of insecurity or need for external validation, providing them with framework for achieving recognition through demonstration of doctrinal zealotry rather than battlefield excellence. The result was creation of informal intelligence networks within the chapter that operated according to principles of mutual surveillance and ideological enforcement. But the most insidious aspect of these networks lay in their impact on overall chapter culture, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that gradually eroded the trust and brotherhood that had traditionally characterized Space Marine organizations. Marines who had previously relied on each other for support during difficult operations began viewing their battle brothers as potential sources of threat, while leadership decisions were increasingly influenced by concerns about doctrinal purity rather than tactical effectiveness. The training programs that Leandros developed for spiritual education represented systematic implementation of psychological conditioning techniques designed to eliminate independent thinking while reinforcing absolute obedience to external authority. The curricula combined legitimate theological instruction with subliminal messaging that created emotional dependence on institutional approval, while generating anxiety about any behavior that deviated from established patterns. The effectiveness of these programs was demonstrated through transformation of entire cohorts of new recruits from individuals who might have developed into innovative leaders into predictable instruments whose responses to any situation could be anticipated based on their conditioning. The uniformity that this created was presented as evidence of successful spiritual development, while the elimination of creative thinking was framed as achievement of proper humility. The expansion of Leandros' influence throughout the Ultramarines chapter occurred gradually through mechanisms that appeared to represent normal advancement of a respected chaplain, rather than systematic infiltration by external interests. His appointment to various oversight committees provided access to personnel files and operational planning, while his role in recruit training ensured that future generations of Marines would be shaped according to his psychological framework. But the most significant development was his increasing influence over chapter doctrine interpretation, using his theological authority to justify modifications to traditional Ultramarines practices that brought them into closer alignment with inquisitorial priorities. The changes were subtle: emphasis on individual surveillance rather than unit cohesion, priority for doctrinal compliance over tactical innovation, and gradual replacement of mentorship relationships with formal reporting hierarchies. The collaboration between Leandros and Inquisitor Thrax reached its culmination with the development of comprehensive surveillance programs that monitored virtually every aspect of chapter operations, while providing external authorities with detailed intelligence about internal dynamics that had previously been protected by Space Marine autonomy. The justification for these programs emphasized security benefits, while their actual purpose involved ensuring that no individual or faction within the chapter could develop sufficient independence to resist outside control. The psychological profiles that these programs generated on every Marine in the chapter represented unprecedented intelligence gathering operation that violated fundamental principles of Space Marine Brotherhood, while providing inquisitorial authorities with capability to identify and eliminate potential leaders before they could achieve positions of influence. But the most horrifying aspect of this collaboration lay in its demonstration that the Imperial system could corrupt even the most elite military organizations through careful manipulation of institutional mechanisms and exploitation of individual psychological vulnerabilities. The Ultramarines Chapter, which had been created to serve as bulwark against humanity's enemies, was being systematically transformed into instrument for oppressing the very populations it had sworn to protect. Standing in his private chambers within the Fortress of Hera, reviewing surveillance reports that detailed the private thoughts and conversations of his battle brothers, Chaplain Leandros represented perfect example of how the Imperial system could transform personal inadequacy into institutional weapon while convincing the weapon that it served righteous purposes. The man who had begun his career as marginally competent tactical marine had evolved into one of the most dangerous individuals in the galaxy, not despite his Imperial training, but because of it. He had become living demonstration that the greatest threat to humanity came not from external enemies, but from internal systems that destroyed human decency while claiming to preserve it. The Inquisition had found their perfect asset, someone whose loyalty was absolute because it was based on psychological dependency rather than rational assessment, whose effectiveness was guaranteed because it operated through institutional authority rather than personal capability, and whose conscience was eliminated because it had been replaced with ideology that justified any action in service of abstract principles. The horror was complete, and it wore the skull-faced helm of righteous authority while destroying everything noble about the warriors it claimed to guide. Chapter 3. The Destruction of Brotherhood. The systematic erosion of traditional Space Marine Brotherhood under Chaplain Leandros' spiritual guidance represented one of the most sophisticated psychological warfare campaigns ever conducted against loyalist Imperial forces, made all the more devastating because it was implemented by someone who genuinely believed he was strengthening the chapter's devotion to the Emperor and the Primarch's teachings. The transformation began subtly, with small changes to establish protocols that appeared to enhance spiritual discipline while actually undermining the interpersonal bonds that had sustained Ultramarines' effectiveness for 10,000 years. The confession protocols that Leandros implemented soon after his elevation to chaplain rank required every Marine to undergo regular spiritual assessments that probed not just their personal faith, but their relationships with battle brothers, their private thoughts about leadership decisions, and their emotional responses to combat situations that might indicate weakness or potential corruption. These sessions were presented as opportunities for spiritual growth and purification, but they actually served as intelligence-gathering operations that created comprehensive psychological profiles of every individual in the chapter. The information gathered through these confessions was used to identify relationships that showed excessive personal loyalty or emotional attachment between Marines, targeting these bonds for systematic disruption through careful manipulation of assignment rotations, tactical deployments, and disciplinary actions. Leandros had identified strong personal relationships as potential security vulnerabilities that could compromise objective judgment and doctrinal compliance. Brother Sergeant Marcus of the Second Company became the first casualty of this campaign against interpersonal bonds when his decade-long partnership with veteran Marine Apollos was terminated through accusations that their tactical coordination had become dependent on personal familiarity rather than adherence to Codex procedures. The charges were technically accurate, but missed the crucial point that their effectiveness exceeded standard performance metrics, specifically because their mutual trust allowed rapid adaptation to battlefield conditions. The separation of Marcus and Apollos was accomplished through administrative reassignments that appeared routine, but were actually calculated to prevent them from serving together, while subjecting both to increased surveillance for signs of emotional distress that might indicate excessive attachment to personal relationships. The psychological pressure of this isolation was presented as test of their spiritual maturity and professional dedication. But the destruction of established partnerships was only the beginning of Leandros' campaign against traditional brotherhood. The mentorship relationships that had historically connected experienced Marines with newer recruits were restructured according to formal hierarchies that emphasized institutional authority over personal guidance, eliminating the informal networks that had traditionally provided emotional support and practical wisdom for Marines facing the psychological challenges of Space Marine service. The replacement of mentorship with formal instruction created educational environments where recruits learned tactical procedures and doctrinal requirements without developing the personal relationships that would provide psychological resilience during combat operations. The result was technically competent Marines who lacked the emotional bonds that had historically enabled Ultramarines units to maintain cohesion under extreme stress. The impact of these changes became evident during the siege of Dacia Prime, where several squads showed unexpected coordination failures despite perfect technical execution of tactical procedures. The Marines involved possessed complete understanding of their assigned roles, but lacked the intuitive awareness of their battle brothers' capabilities and psychological state that would have enabled adaptive response to rapidly changing combat conditions. The after-action analysis that Leandros conducted attributed these failures to insufficient training, rather than recognizing that the systematic destruction of interpersonal bonds had eliminated crucial elements of unit effectiveness. His recommendations emphasized additional doctrinal instruction and enhanced surveillance for signs of tactical deviation, completely missing the actual cause of performance degradation. The surveillance networks that he established among the younger Marines represented the most insidious aspect of his campaign against Brotherhood, turning spiritual guidance into systematic espionage that encouraged Marines to report on the private conversations, personal habits, and emotional responses of their battle brothers. These reporting requirements were presented as opportunities to demonstrate devotion to chapter welfare, while actually creating an atmosphere of mutual suspicion that eliminated trust. The psychological conditioning that made this surveillance system effective involved reframing normal human emotional responses as potential indicators of spiritual weakness or corruption that required investigation for the protection of the individual involved and the chapter as a whole. Expressions of doubt about tactical decisions, emotional responses to casualties among close associates, and personal criticism of leadership policies were redefined as warning signs that demanded official attention. Brother Cassius of the 6th Company discovered the extent of this surveillance system when he was subjected to formal questioning about comments he had made regarding Captain Sicarius's tactical decisions during a recent engagement with Dark Elder forces. The investigation revealed that his casual conversation with a battle brother had been reported through channels that he hadn't known existed, while the interrogation techniques employed suggested that his loyalty was being assessed based on criteria that had never been officially announced. The psychological impact of discovering that private conversations were subject to official scrutiny created paranoia that extended throughout the chapter as Marines realized that their personal relationships were being monitored and evaluated by authorities whose standards remained deliberately unclear. The result was dramatic reduction in informal communication between Marines, eliminating the social bonds that had historically provided emotional support during difficult operations. The replacement of natural brotherhood with artificial unity based on shared fear of surveillance represented fundamental transformation of chapter culture from organization based on mutual trust and respect into hierarchical system that maintained cohesion through mechanisms of control rather than genuine cooperation. The efficiency gains that Leandros claimed from these changes were largely illusory, reflecting improved compliance with formal procedures rather than enhanced combat effectiveness. The elimination of traditional warrior culture reached its culmination with the implementation of new protocols for honoring the dead that replaced personal grief and remembrance with formal ceremonies that emphasized duty to the chapter rather than loss of individual relationships. The funeral rites that Leandros conducted treated fallen Marines as abstract symbols of Imperial service, rather than recognizing them as unique individuals whose absence created genuine loss for their surviving battle brothers. The prohibition of personal mourning rituals that had historically allowed Marines to process grief and maintain emotional connection to deceased comrades was justified as prevention of excessive attachment that might compromise future combat effectiveness. The psychological impact of this policy created unresolved emotional trauma that accumulated among Marines who were denied normal methods for processing the death of close associates. The cultural transformation was completed through revision of traditional Ultramarines customs that had emphasized individual achievement within context of brotherhood solidarity. The competitive exercises and informal gatherings that had historically strengthened interpersonal bonds were replaced with formal activities that emphasized conformity and compliance rather than personal excellence and mutual respect. The training programs that prepared Marines for leadership roles were restructured to eliminate emphasis on understanding and inspiring subordinates, replacing these skills with techniques for managing personnel through administrative procedures and disciplinary systems. The result was officers who could maintain order through institutional authority, but lacked the personal charisma and emotional intelligence that had characterized effective Ultramarines leaders throughout history. The psychological assessment procedures that determined advancement opportunities were modified to reward characteristics that aligned with Leandros' vision of proper conduct, while penalizing traits that had historically been considered valuable for Space Marine service. Innovation, emotional intelligence, and natural leadership ability were redefined as potential security risks that required careful monitoring. But the most devastating impact of Leandros' reforms involved their effect on recruitment and selection procedures that determined which candidates would be accepted for transformation into Space Marines. The psychological profiles that he developed as screening criteria eliminated individuals whose personalities showed characteristics that might resist institutional control, selecting instead for compliance and dependency that would ensure absolute obedience to authority. The result was gradual transformation of the Ultramarines from organization of warrior heroes who served humanity through individual excellence and mutual cooperation into bureaucratic military unit whose effectiveness depended on rigid adherence to procedures rather than adaptive leadership and creative problem-solving. The change was subtle enough that external observers might not recognize the degradation, but experienced Marines could perceive the loss of essential characteristics that had made their chapter legendary. Standing in the chapter's Hall of Honor, surrounded by banners and trophies that commemorated 10,000 years of Ultramarines' achievements, I reflected on how completely the traditions they represented had been corrupted through systematic destruction of the human elements that had made those achievements possible. The brotherhood that had enabled our greatest victories had been replaced with a surveillance system that treated every Marine as potential threat to institutional security. Chaplain Leandros had succeeded in creating perfect Imperial soldiers, individuals whose loyalty was absolute because it was based on psychological conditioning rather than rational commitment, whose effectiveness was guaranteed because it operated through institutional authority rather than personal excellence, and whose humanity had been systematically eliminated because it was perceived as weakness that compromised operational efficiency. The transformation was complete, and what remained bore the name and colors of the Ultramarines, while lacking everything that had made that name worthy of respect throughout the galaxy. Chapter 4: The Cult of Perfect Compliance. The ideological framework that Chaplain Leandros constructed around the concept of perfect compliance represented one of the most sophisticated systems of psychological control ever developed within Imperial Space Marine organizations, combining legitimate theological concepts with manipulation techniques that gradually transformed independent warriors into willing instruments of institutional oppression. The doctrine emerged during his third year as chaplain, presented initially as spiritual guidance for achieving optimal service to the Emperor and Primarch Guilliman's vision of ordered excellence. Perfect compliance was defined as a state of spiritual and tactical harmony, achieved when individual will was completely subordinated to institutional authority, eliminating personal desires, emotional attachments, and independent judgment that might conflict with optimal execution of assigned duties. The concept was supported by carefully selected quotations from the Codex Astartes and Imperial religious texts, creating appearance of theological legitimacy, while actually promoting psychological dependency that exceeded anything the original sources had intended. The educational programs that Leandros developed to promote perfect compliance incorporated advanced psychological conditioning techniques disguised as meditation and spiritual exercises. The daily rituals that he prescribed for spiritual development involved repetitive recitation of doctrinal principles combined with mental exercises designed to suppress critical thinking and emotional responses that might generate resistance to external authority. The effectiveness of these techniques was demonstrated through systematic transformation of individual personality characteristics among Marines who underwent extended exposure to the program. Warriors who had previously shown initiative and creative problem-solving capabilities gradually developed behavioral patterns that prioritized seeking approval from superiors over making independent tactical decisions, while their emotional responses to combat stress were channeled into religious fervor that enhanced compliance rather than promoting adaptive responses. Brother Tiberius of the Third Company became the first documented case of complete transformation through perfect compliance conditioning, evolving from aggressive assault marine whose tactical innovations had earned commendations into passive instrument whose combat effectiveness depended entirely on detailed instructions from command personnel. His psychological profile showed elimination of virtually all independent thought processes, replaced by automatic responses that aligned with institutional expectations regardless of situational factors that might suggest alternative approaches. The celebration of Tiberius's transformation as spiritual achievement rather than psychological destruction demonstrated how effectively Leandros had redefined success criteria within the chapter hierarchy. Officers who might have been concerned about the elimination of initiative and creativity were convinced that such characteristics represented spiritual weaknesses that compromised unit effectiveness, while the predictability that conditioning created was presented as evidence of superior discipline and devotion. But the most insidious aspect of perfect compliance doctrine involved its systematic elimination of moral reasoning capabilities among Marines who might otherwise have resisted orders that violated their ethical principles or endangered civilian populations. The conditioning process replaced personal moral judgment with absolute trust in institutional authority, creating individuals who would execute any command while maintaining conviction that their actions served righteous purposes. The field testing of these principles occurred during the compliance operations on Tertius Minor, where civilian populations had been classified as potential security threats due to their resistance to Imperial taxation policies. The Ultramarines forces, led by perfect compliance graduates, executed suppression operations with mechanical efficiency that eliminated opposition while showing no emotional response to the civilian casualties that their tactics inevitably created. The after-action reports from Tertius Minor praised the tactical discipline and emotional stability demonstrated by the perfect compliance Marines, noting their ability to maintain optimal combat performance regardless of moral ambiguity that might have affected less conditioned personnel. The psychological profiles showed that these Marines had processed civilian deaths as necessary tactical outcomes rather than experiencing the guilt or trauma that normal human psychology would generate. But the elimination of normal moral responses created operational risks that Leandros had failed to anticipate during his theoretical development of the doctrine. Marines who lacked empathy and emotional connection to the populations they were supposed to protect showed decreased motivation for personal sacrifice when missions required accepting casualties to preserve civilian lives, while their tactical decision-making showed systematic bias towards solutions that prioritized efficiency over humanitarian considerations. The recruitment protocols that Leandros established for identifying candidates suitable for perfect compliance conditioning represented systematic screening for psychological characteristics that would respond effectively to manipulation while eliminating individuals whose personality traits might resist institutional control. The selection criteria prioritized candidates who showed high need for external validation, combined with minimal capacity for independent, ethical reasoning. The training facilities that were established for perfect compliance conditioning operated according to principles that combined legitimate spiritual instruction with sophisticated brainwashing techniques developed through analysis of the most effective indoctrination methods used by various Imperial organizations. The physical environment was designed to create sensory deprivation and social isolation that increased psychological vulnerability to suggestion, while the instructional content gradually reshaped cognitive processes according to predetermined patterns. The daily schedule for conditioning subjects involved 16 hours of combined instruction, meditation, and physical exercise designed to eliminate privacy and independent thought, while reinforcing institutional messaging through constant repetition. The remaining 8 hours were allocated for supervised rest that included subliminal audio programming designed to continue psychological modification during sleep cycles. The graduation ceremonies for successful conditioning subjects represented formal transformation of individual identity into institutional function, with each graduate receiving new assignment designation that replaced their previous name with numerical identifier that emphasized their role as interchangeable components of larger system. The psychological impact of this identity elimination created complete dependency on institutional approval for sense of personal worth and purpose. The expansion of perfect compliance doctrine throughout the chapter occurred through mandatory training programs that were presented as spiritual development opportunities while actually serving to identify and eliminate sources of potential resistance to institutional control. Marines who showed negative reactions to conditioning procedures were classified as spiritually weak and subjected to enhanced remediation that continued until they achieved acceptable compliance levels or were transferred to positions where their influence over others would be minimized. The influence of perfect compliance doctrine extended beyond individual behavior modification to encompass systematic changes in chapter organization and operational procedures that emphasize predictability and control over the flexibility and innovation that had historically characterized Ultramarines' tactical excellence. The command structures were redesigned to eliminate informal authority relationships while concentrating decision-making power among officers who had demonstrated complete adherence to Leandros' psychological framework. The intelligence networks that emerged from perfect compliance conditioning created comprehensive surveillance systems that monitored every aspect of chapter operations, while providing authorities with detailed psychological assessments of personnel whose loyalty might be questionable. The information gathered through these networks was used to identify and eliminate potential sources of resistance before they could achieve positions of influence within the organization. But the most disturbing application of perfect compliance principles involved their use in managing relationships with civilian populations that Space Marines encountered during military operations. The conditioning that eliminated empathy and independent moral reasoning among Marines created personnel who could execute population control measures with mechanical efficiency while maintaining absolute conviction that their actions served necessary purposes. The civilian compliance operations that were conducted using perfect compliance graduates demonstrated systematic implementation of techniques for breaking down resistance among populations whose cooperation was considered essential for Imperial security. The psychological conditioning that eliminated normal human emotional responses among the Marines involved allowed them to execute these operations without experiencing stress or moral conflict that might compromise their effectiveness. The theological justifications that Leandros developed for perfect compliance doctrine represented sophisticated distortion of legitimate Imperial religious concepts, using spiritual authority to legitimize psychological manipulation, while preventing resistance through appeals to sacred duty and divine purpose. The framework that he created made questioning the doctrine equivalent to questioning the Emperor's will, creating religious taboos that prevented rational analysis of its actual effects. The long-term psychological impact of perfect compliance conditioning on Marines who underwent the process represented fundamental transformation of human consciousness into something that retained intelligence and combat capability, while lacking essential characteristics that defined authentic humanity. The result was creation of personnel who functioned as sophisticated biological machines, rather than warriors capable of heroism and moral choice. Standing in the conditioning chamber, where dozens of young Marines underwent daily programming designed to eliminate their capacity for independent thought and moral reasoning, Chaplain Leandros observed the systematic destruction of everything that made humanity worth defending, while maintaining absolute conviction that he was creating superior servants of the Imperial cause. The perfect compliance doctrine had achieved its intended purpose: transformation of space marines from heroes capable of inspiring hope and protecting innocent life into instruments whose effectiveness was guaranteed because they lacked the human characteristics that might prevent them from executing any order regardless of its moral implications. The cult was complete, and its devotees served with absolute loyalty because they had been systematically stripped of everything that might have enabled them to recognize what they had become. Chapter 5. The Purging of Heroes. The systematic elimination of Marines whose service records demonstrated the kind of heroic excellence that had historically defined Ultramarines tradition represented Chaplain Leandros' most ambitious project, requiring careful coordination between doctrinal authority and administrative manipulation to remove individuals whose example might inspire resistance to the perfect compliance transformation. The campaign began with identification of personnel whose achievements exceeded what institutional guidelines considered optimal for maintaining unit cohesion and command authority. Captain Titus's eventual return from inquisitorial custody provided the perfect test case for demonstrating how even the most decorated heroes could be neutralized through systematic application of psychological pressure and administrative harassment. His reappearance after decades of rumored death created enormous morale boost throughout the chapter, but Leandros recognized immediately that Titus's natural leadership qualities and reputation for tactical brilliance posed existential threat to the compliance-based culture he had worked to establish. The initial approach involved subjecting Titus to extensive spiritual assessment procedures that were ostensibly designed to ensure that his extended contact with inquisitorial authorities hadn't compromised his psychological stability or doctrinal purity. The sessions combined legitimate security screening with psychological pressure designed to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited to discredit his influence among Marines who remembered his previous achievements. The interrogation techniques that Leandros employed during these assessments represented sophisticated fusion of religious authority with manipulation methods designed to break down psychological resistance while extracting information that could be used to justify continued surveillance or disciplinary action. The sacred context of spiritual guidance provided cover for questioning that would have been recognized as hostile investigation if conducted by external authorities. But Titus's psychological resilience, enhanced by whatever experiences he had endured during his inquisitorial imprisonment, proved resistant to conventional pressure techniques. His responses to doctrinal questioning demonstrated perfect compliance with Ultramarines traditions while revealing nothing that could be used to justify accusations of spiritual weakness or ideological deviation. The failure of standard conditioning procedures to affect his mental state forced Leandros to develop more sophisticated approaches. The administrative harassment campaign that followed involved systematic use of bureaucratic procedures to isolate Titus from meaningful command responsibilities, while subjecting him to continuous performance evaluations that emphasized minor procedural violations over tactical achievements. His assignment to training duties with new recruits was presented as recognition of his teaching capabilities, while actually serving to limit his influence over operational personnel. The psychological pressure of being effectively demoted despite his exemplary service record was intended to generate emotional responses that could be interpreted as evidence of pride or insubordination, providing justification for formal disciplinary action that would further reduce his influence within the chapter. But Titus's response demonstrated exactly the kind of mature leadership that made him dangerous to compliance-based authority structures. Instead of responding with anger or resentment to administrative persecution, Titus embraced his training responsibilities with dedication that transformed them into opportunities for inspiring new Marines, with examples of tactical excellence and moral courage that directly contradicted perfect compliance doctrine. His instruction methods emphasized individual initiative and creative problem-solving, while his personal example demonstrated that heroic achievement was possible through adherence to traditional Ultramarines values. The impact of Titus's teaching became evident through performance improvements among recruits who underwent his training. But more dangerously for Leandros' purposes, These Marines also showed resistance to perfect compliance conditioning that suggested they had developed psychological frameworks that prioritized personal moral reasoning over institutional authority. The correlation between exposure to Titus's instruction and resistance to psychological manipulation was too obvious to ignore. The escalation to direct confrontation became inevitable when several Marines who had been trained by Titus were discovered discussing tactical innovations that deviated from established Codex procedures while expressing doubts about surveillance policies that required reporting on the private conversations of their battle brothers. The investigation of these discussions revealed that Titus had been teaching principles of independent judgment and moral reasoning that directly contradicted perfect compliance doctrine. The formal charges that Leandros brought against Titus represented masterpiece of administrative manipulation, combining legitimate concerns about doctrinal adherence with fabricated evidence of insubordination and spiritual corruption. The case was constructed to appear legally sound, while actually representing persecution of someone whose only crime was maintaining traditional Ultramarines values that conflicted with new institutional priorities. But the most insidious aspect of the campaign against Titus involved its impact on other Marines who observed how heroic service and exemplary character could be punished through manipulation of institutional procedures. The message was clear. Individual excellence that exceeded approved parameters would be treated as threat to unit cohesion, regardless of its positive effects on mission accomplishment or morale. The trial proceedings that determined Titus's fate demonstrated how institutional authority could be weaponized against anyone whose presence challenged established power structures, even when that challenge came through positive example rather than direct confrontation. The evidence presented against him was technically accurate while being fundamentally misleading, creating appearance of legitimate security concerns while actually representing elimination of leadership that might inspire resistance to administrative control. The execution of Captain Titus through combat assignment, designed to ensure his death, marked the completion of the first phase of Leandros' campaign against heroic excellence. The circumstances were arranged to appear as honorable warrior's death while actually representing calculated murder disguised as tactical necessity. The psychological impact on Marines who understood what had actually occurred created an atmosphere of fear that discouraged any demonstration of exceptional achievement.